On this episode of China Unscripted, CCP propaganda is everywhere. Here's how you can keep yourself from falling for it. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganesha.
And joining us once again is Levi Browde, which I prefer to say Brody.
No, you got it right the first time.
I know, but you put the bro in Brody.
Oh, dear. Here we go.
I guess more importantly than that is that you are the executive director of the Falun Dafa Information Center, and it's an organization dedicated to ending the human rights abuses of Falun Gong. And, well, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me
again.
Great to see you guys.
Yeah, not many people join us in our underground bunker in under
34 floors beneath the Empire State Building.
Yeah, that's right. Excuse me. So you're here because a new report has come out about some crazy things the CCP is doing to Shen Yun.
Yes.
And there's been some updates. So let's get into that. Well, first of all, you're the executive director of the Falun Dafa Information Center. What's the connection between that and Shen Yun?
So Shen Yun, the performing arts company, was essentially founded by Falun Gong practitioners. It's run primarily by Falun Gong practitioners. And so as part of the sort of transnational repression campaign that the CCP unleashes on Falun Gong globally, Shen Yun is kind of a key part of that. And so as part of our coverage of what they're doing to silence Falun Gong around the world, we decided to do a deep dive on Shen Yun because that's clearly one of their main targets now in trying to silence what they would say are Falun Gong voices of, talking about what's happening in China and things of that nature. Yeah.
I mean, excuse me. I think I have something in my throat. I guess what I really find interesting about Shen Yun is, sorry, excuse me. Oh my God! Oh, Shen Yun, China before communism. You get your ads everywhere. How do you?
That whole thing was a setup for this, Chris.
Okay, I'm sorry. Was the gag that it came out of your throat?
They get their ads everywhere.
In fairness, I was actually going to do a bit where I put a billboard up in our skyscraper set in the back, as a little subtle thing, but I didn't think it'd be big enough to see. And we were kind of thinking on the same.
How long have you been planning that?
Years.
Anderson, you'll have to do some, magic to make that look better, right? No.
I think it was flawless. But this is interesting. I think what most people think of when they think of Shen Yun is just ads everywhere. It's become somewhat of a meme.
I saw the meme where the Mars rover found a Shen Yun billboard. Did you see that one a few years ago?
That was fake? Yeah, I mean, it's incredible how much effort is being put into getting this message out for a Chinese song and dance show.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of the folks that, not just Shen Yun, but sort of Falun Dafa, Falun Gong associations around the world, I think there's a real recognition that this is important on a broader sort of cultural context because, for the last 70 years, they've been trying to totally destroy Chinese culture. This is a way to not only sort of make sure that doesn't die out, but hey, let's share it with the world in kind of an interesting, captivating way. And so I think it's a lot of the folks promoting the Shen Yun show feel that this is something really they want to share culturally with the world. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm, hence a lot of billboards.
Flyers everywhere. Well, what I found interesting is because when the report came out, we covered it on China Uncensored. And, the tagline of Shen Yun is China before communism. And a lot of people were saying at the episode, oh, Shen Yun's against communism? Awesome. I'm going to go.
You mean people in the comments?
Yeah, people in the comments section.
Yeah, I did see a lot of people saying they thought it was a CCP show, which I was actually surprised about.
Yeah. I mean, China before communism. Are you guys?
Seems clear.
It seems clear. Have you thought about doing some rebranding to sort of, upfront the anti-communist message?
Well, I don't know. That didn't come up when I was sort of talking with the Shen Yun folks and doing some research. I mean, I did get to look at one of the things we did when we were doing this report is Shen Yun let us look at a lot of the comments they get on their social media. We studied a lot of the interviews. A lot of times after they do a show, they'll do interviews with people who just saw the show, just say, hey, what did you think? What did you just see? And so we got to sort of go through that. And I was still surprised by, not after the show, people are clear on what it was, but the comments on social media that people make sometimes before they've gone to the show or before they've seen it. There is still a percentage there that are sort of like, you commies, go back to China. And so it is interesting that that's still a confusion. I guess people don't see the tagline or don't fully understand.
It's ironic because, the other side of it is like people are like, oh, you're a bunch of commies. And the other people are like, oh, you're a bunch of Falun Gong.
You're not a bunch of commies. How dare you? Well, I think it's, this is actually part of, I think, what the CCP does with their propaganda is try to conflate Chinese culture so much with the Chinese Communist Party and things like, without the Communist Party, there is no new China, and using culture as a way to, get government officials to come to events sponsored by the Chinese consulates I'm not surprised in a certain sense that people, when they think of Chinese culture, they automatically think of the Chinese government because the Chinese government has used culture as the propaganda tool for so long.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we see that actually is, we studied a bunch of different cases of Chinese diplomats going after Shen Yun in probably over 38 countries. And one of the key things that they do is they first target the theater managers because, these guys don't know. They run a theater. They're not used to having a government come in and sort of manhandle them and say, oh, you can't do this, and scare them about what Shen Yun is and the nature of Shen Yun. But if you look at a lot of those letters, the content of what their sort of strong-arm tactics are, these billboards, having Shen Yun at your theater, this is really going to be offensive to the Chinese tourists and the Chinese business people, as if showcasing Chinese culture, as Shen Yun does, is an affront to all Chinese people. And it's sort of the exact same tactic I think you're talking about, Shelley, is they really try and not just blur the lines, but co-opt themselves as the true shepherds of Chinese culture and the Chinese people. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there is also the degree that sometimes overseas Chinese people do seem to be offended when you talk about Falun Gong stuff or when they see like a Falun Gong, table or something at a fair, that kind of thing. Right. So there is that sort of cohort of overseas Chinese that do feel offended by it. Like, why is that?
Well, I think you'd sort of have to break that down. I think my sense is that there's going to be a certain percentage of those, perhaps large percentage, that deep down inside they're not offended. They know what the party line is and they want to toe that, and especially if they can make a public display of that. And there's pressure to do that. So I think there's certainly an amount of people that coming from China that are like, oh, I know what the party line is on Falun Gong here. Let me articulate that or let me act that out. But then there's also a significant portion that are genuine because all they've heard for the last 25 years from the state-run media is Falun Gong's evil, they kill people, they eat their babies, who knows what all kinds of stuff that they say. And, I think everybody thinks that propaganda doesn't work on them, they're a little bit, most people think they can rise above that. And one of the things I've learned after 25 years of watching what the CCP does to Falun Gong is it works on everybody eventually.
Except for you.
Except for me. And so you have even very sort of well-educated, very intelligent people coming out of China that will spew things that are clear lies, clearly stuff that's debunked about Falun Gong, but they actually believe that just because it's been reiterated so many times and in various nuances, different ways through the state-run media. So you do have people that are like that. For
sure. I
mean,
it's like I occasionally meet people who have just recently come overseas from China and they don't know anything about the Tiananmen Square massacre.
Well, again, I think that's interesting because I remember seeing a documentary where they sat down with 6, 7 Chinese students and they showed them the Tank Man. And they all said, oh, I don't know what that is. This was 15 years ago. And, I think the people doing the documentary understood that, well, either they know what it is and they don't want to say, or perhaps they don't know what it is. There's definitely a mix of those two. Yeah.
Well, so this is interesting because in your report, you talk about all the ways that the CCP is attacking Shen Yun. But it also seems like then if they're able to successfully propagandize other people, they could get, maybe actually Chinese people or other people who are tied to China criticizing Shen Yun on their behalf without even really knowing it.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think that's one of the core That's one of the core tactics. I mean, mostly the diplomats they'll go after the theaters because they think those are an easy target, but their very next move is Ministry of Foreign Affairs for that country or whatever the equivalent is, to try and sort of pressure that government in that country to then go to the theater and say, you know what, we can't do this. And in some cases, they even go after companies. And every time they go after it, it's not just don't do this or will sever economic ties. They'll include that kind of stuff, but they're always sliding in stuff like this is a dangerous group. The propaganda is always there, whether it's a letter, an in-person meeting, an email. And so they're trying to not only go after the theaters, but they're trying to get that government and the people in that country to do their bidding as well.
I mean, is this a normal thing? Like, does the Russian government do it? Does the Iranian government do it if you want to have like a Persian dance show?
I have never heard of that. Certainly would never be of this scale. I mean, I think, if you look at, to no surprise, right? When Freedom House I think they did the best study on transnational oppression overall back in 2021. And to no surprise, right? They found China is by far the worst aggressor of that all around the world. And then if you look at China itself, and even some of the leaked documents coming out of the CCP, Falun Gong is the centerpiece of their transnational oppression. So I think that indicates that China does this way beyond anybody else. I've never heard of anything approaching the scale of this kind of campaign going after an arts company or some sort of group that's either doing arts or freedom of expression, things like that.
So just to be clear, you're saying Falun Gong is still their number one international target?
It's high priority. We know that for sure. I mean, some of the documents that we see, actually, it's interesting in recent years, for years they've been silent about this. When they first started with the persecution, it was very sort of overt, kind of Cultural Revolution style propaganda. And then around 2003, right, they go silent. Everything goes quiet because they want everything to go underground. Over the last 3 years, we actually did a report on this about 3 months ago where we went back the last year or two, and what's new is that you start to see public speeches of CCP officials, both sort of at the provincial level, even some at the national level, starting to be overt and public about how important Falun Gong is as a political enemy. And so they're starting to be very public about that. And then if you look at, again, at we get CCP leaked documents every once in a while. They specifically call out Falun Gong as one of the top priorities internationally. And as part of that, Shen Yun is an important aspect of that. Yeah.
Do they say what their other priority targets are?
The usual, Taiwan, Hong Kong. You get some of that mixed in. But Falun Gong it's interesting how they spell out also the detail about, they actually describe strategically dividing Falun Gong, separating them from would-be allies internationally. I assume they mean our government officials here that support us and things of that nature. So they're pretty specific.
Why do you think this is happening with the overt mentions of, because I would say that if you look at kind of what people think about the human rights landscape in relation to China, Falun Gong isn't top of mind for many rights organizations. Really the last 5 or 6 years, it's been the Uyghurs and what's happening in Xinjiang that's getting a lot of Western attention. So why do you think that this is, if the CCP wanted to have the repression of Falun Gong kind of, disappear in the eyes of the Western public, they've essentially succeeded in many ways, right? So why do you think this is coming up again?
I actually think they're doing this because they're losing. And what I mean by that is, they've gotten to the point where they realize Falun Gong's not going to go away, right? When this persecution first started, right, Jiang Zemin was 3 months, we're going to stamp them out. That didn't happen, obviously. 25 years later, Falun Gong's very, very active. You got tens of millions of people doing a lot of civil disobedience activity, spreading the word about what the CCP is doing to them, all that kind of stuff inside China. Outside China, there is no other group. If you look at companies and human rights organizations and other projects that have come out of the Falun Gong community, Shen Yun being one of them, there is no other group that is this visible and this impactful, I would say, on the world stage about articulating all the stuff the CCP doesn't want you to talk about. What's the nature of the CCP? What's real Chinese culture, and how is that separate from the CCP? So my sense is, none of us are in the back rooms of when the CCP is devising whether they're going to go public again or not on Falun Gong. But my sense is this is coming out as Shen Yun and other groups like this are becoming really impactful on the world stage, and they realize that they're not going to get rid of Falun Gong. They're way past that. So now the only fight they can have is one of narrative, of one of, can we malign or marginalize Falun Gong enough? Can we marginalize Shen Yun enough where people stop listening to them? And I think that's why they're going public.
I mean, Shen Yun has become a meme. That's
Yeah,
the most
exactly.
memes are the most powerful thing in the world currently. Well, what I find interesting is 10, 15 years ago, if somebody were to criticize Falun Gong, it would be basically repeating these party talking points. Maybe that Falun Gong, it's China Scientology, or they have all these kinds of weird beliefs. But lately, because of a lot of other media attacks on Falun Gong linked media like the Epoch Times, the criticism is Falun Gong is far right. They like Trump. And I mean, I don't think there's anything more evil in the world than liking Trump. So, I mean, how is this attack factoring in on, because I'm sure the party loves the idea that Western media are attacking Falun Gong and Shen Yun.
Yeah, I mean, as I was going through all the different, so one thing Shen Yun did is they gave us all, Shen Yun itself, and actually one of the Shen Yun presenters in Washington, D.C. has been gathering these cases for years. And so we went through all those as part of making this report. And one of the things I noticed just 2 weeks ago, there was there's sometimes the CCP will organize protesters, sometimes paying them, oftentimes paying them outside a theater where Shen Yun is performing. That's common.
How much do they pay?
I think you're making more here. I think.
Okay.
We'll
talk later.
So, 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a little protest outside a show, I think down in Florida, and it was a bunch of all American college kids. And they were holding up a sign. One of them said something like, "Oh, Falun Gong is racist because they don't allow interracial marriage." And I thought that was interesting. It goes directly to the heart of why we did the report now. And that is what the CCP has realized is, okay, most of their attempts at this point, aside from the Belt and Road countries, have failed to stop having Shen Yun be hosted. And so they said, okay, if we can't get the show canceled, we're going to get Americans to not want to go. So how do they do that? For years, they've been looking at the hot button issues here in America, and they're trying to they've been doing the cult thing for a while, but they've been looking at the hot button issues, and they're saying, okay, how can we use these to sort of malign Falun Gong and by extension Shen Yun? And for a few years now, they've been trying to put this idea that, as an example, that Shen Yun's racist because we don't allow interracial marriage. So problem with that is reality, right? If you look at the Falun Gong community, not just across the United States, but around the world, there's probably more interracial marriages in that community than most communities. So it's total BS. But they don't care about that. What they're banking on the fact that Falun Gong is a foreign word, Shen Yun's a foreign word, racism's a hot button issue. Let's put this out there. And that's sort of to gain traction. And it was interesting to see those college kids they're holding up a sign that's clearly a blatant lie, but they believe it. And not only are they not going to go see Shen Yun because of that, they're willing to stand out there and protest. That is the CCP directly manipulating the way Americans think. And I think that's what's particularly dangerous about the broader transnational repression against Falun Gong, but specifically what's happening with Shen Yun. And that's one of the reasons we decided, we got to do this report now. And so people see how the CCP is kind of engineering this whole thing.
Did anyone talk to those college kids? I'm just kind of curious.
I hope so, because I was shocked to see that.
It just seems kind of, you're talking about a small Florida town or?
I don't remember which city it was, but it was in Florida. Yeah,
it just
a college town.
A college town in Florida. See, that just feels like kind of what you were saying with the theater managers, right? The CCP will just go. It doesn't matter how kind of small the venue or place. It kind of reminds me of, you remember when COVID hit and we interviewed this state senator from, was it Iowa?
Wisconsin,
or
I thought.
Wisconsin, yes, where essentially the Chinese consulate was calling his office up to try to get him to make a statement in support of, this Chinese government and their handling of COVID. And you're just like, why is the Chinese consulate calling a state senator in Wisconsin? There is, they don't care. They will try to, extend that influence. college kids at some college town in Florida,
Well, that's what, I always looked at Chinese propaganda inside China and seen how overt it is and on the nose and kind of like obvious. And I was like, these guys are not very good at this. I've realized over the years they're actually quite good. They're tailoring to an audience. That propaganda that they've done in China for years is pretty much tailored to that audience. And I think what they know in the West is that it's a long-term game, and it's something you have to start at the grassroots. And actually, it's easier to get certain propaganda to have traction or intimidate people at the grassroots level, the small college, the small city council, these sort of low-level folks, and that will build. And indeed, that's to some extent what's happening, and it's very much what they're doing.
Because I kind of tend to think of like the Communist Party's attempts at propaganda in the U.S. to be really ham-fisted.
Right.
But those are just maybe the ones we see. Right?
Exactly.
Like we see all the dumb statements they make, like, that was totally a weather balloon only for meteorological purposes. And nobody believes that.
Or you look at
right?
China Daily putting out these really, like that James Bond skit that they did that everybody was making fun of. And then you're like, oh, that's...
I was so embarrassed by how bad that video was that I basically couldn't watch it. But that's the ham-fisted stuff, right? So what you're saying is that actually, there's a huge amount that is working really well and is not ham-fisted and is kind of just penetrating at a really subtle level.
And it's done with a very clear sense for what will trigger people here, what people will latch onto without doing too much research, I would assume, like these college kids. Like one example, I'll give you another example. A couple of years ago, the New York Times did a huge piece on various aspects of actually, they were going to some of the Epoch Times, but they also pulled in Falun Gong. And it was a large piece. And included in that article was this reference to, I think the way they worded it is some people are concerned with the extreme beliefs of Falun Gong, which includes forbidding interracial marriage. And they have a link to what's their source. So you go through the source, it goes to an Australian article. And you say, what's the substance of that article? Well, it was just this one disgruntled girl who's quoting the Chinese government. And that leads back to the Chinese government's English language webpage on the Chinese consulate website. And that's where they have a whole breakdown of Falun Gong is racist and this is why they're racist. That's the sum total, the source. So you can see how they sort of just have to put it out there and people will bite.
And then it kind of becomes circular. And then eventually the New York Times picks it up. And
but why would the New York Times do that? Why would they only stop at if you can trace that Australian article back to some state-run media, why didn't the New York Times?
Well,
the most prestigious paper in America.
That's. I think that might tie back to the enormous love many of these people have for Donald Trump. I mean, once they got
you're being facetious.
No. Once they got the idea that this country became highly tribal 4 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever it was. And I think it's whether you're a senior editor at the New York Times or whoever you are, if there's some whiff of you're in this tribe versus that tribe, it's going to have people jump on the issue without perhaps doing too much research.
It was...
Levi, I'm sorry to have to tell you that it was 8 years ago now.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, but it was very interesting.
How old am I?
Let's not answer these questions. But yeah, it was very interesting to see the effect Trump had in the the Chinese diaspora community or the Chinese activist community in the United States, because a lot of the message was Trump was an evil racist. But then in the Chinese community, a lot of Chinese activists, I remember, maybe I won't. Well, we had them both on, Zhou Fengsuo and I can't remember who the name of the other guy.
Oh no. You shouldn't have started this.
I know. It's slipping my mind. I was hoping it would come up. But basically, there was this division within the Chinese diaspora community about, some people were really fond of Trump because he was going after China in a way no U.S. president had done before. And so that created a lot of division.
I mean, I think their division was more about, how overt, tactics about, how to counter the CCP more than anything. But you do see a lot of... Chinese immigrants who have dealt with the CCP, becoming pro-Trump. And there was actually a very interesting article about this by Perry Link. I think it was in the New York Review of Books, which I felt was actually a very understandable deep dive into this phenomenon where he wasn't judging people for it. He was essentially saying, look, if you want to understand why this is happening, perhaps you should look back on U.S. policy towards China during the last like 4 administrations and see kind of what a failure it's been and how it's disappointed, Chinese Americans, and then you can kind of understand why like people were really cheering this completely different in-your-face approach towards the CCP.
And like the New York Times decades nary a peep about organ harvesting as an example of a major China issue.
There was, I remember this one meeting, I saw the video of this, where Trump was meeting with a whole bunch of like Chinese activists from different groups.
Yeah,
there was
Uyghurs.
There was Uyghurs, there was Falun Gong, Hong Kong, whatever, the bunch of groups, right?
Oh, it was like, I think it was international actually, because it was like religious.
Oh, it was religious, that's right.
Religious,
That's right.
victims of religious repression.
Yeah, but there were like a bunch of Chinese people, including Uyghurs in that because they're currently in China. But like, I thought that was interesting. I don't know whether Trump was doing that because he truly cared or because he wanted to make a political statement or whatever. It's kind of irrelevant why. But the fact is that there were a lot of people who saw that and they're like, oh, that's actually like a really positive thing. And that makes me feel good that he's meeting with members of my community, whether it's Uyghurs or any of the other groups.
Yeah, I mean, I think that whole time period was a similar phenomenon to what we're seeing now on the racism issue, where it's this hot button issue that people want to jump on, and they have a sense that they can. The Chinese government's telling them that they can, and so they jump on it. I think you saw that with the Trump years, because as you pointed out, there was a whole section of the Chinese diaspora in general that was embracing not necessarily the man, but the policy on China.
Just very specifically the China policy,
very,
too.
very, very specific. And I think, honestly, Falun Gong kind of just got lumped into that. And because there was this murmur from the Chinese government for years about, oh, this is kind of a cult, honestly, I think people jumped on and said, okay, the Chinese people, there's a whole section of the Chinese people that are supporting Donald Trump, but these guys are being called a cult by the Chinese government. Let's go after these guys because now we can link Trump and cult. Great. It's this whole tribal mentality. And it's, if you think about it, it's how ridiculous is it to think, Falun Gong is practiced in 100 countries around the world. I would think a vast majority of those folks don't know about Trump or don't
everybody
care.
knows about Trump.
Well, I don't know.
Like
I don't know.
small tribes living in the
Togo,
Amazon,
Africa.
they know.
I get Levi's point. Like for most of the people in the world, like Trump is not like the immediate.
It's a non-factor. It's just not part of their lives. They don't care. They don't even. They probably couldn't tell you what political party he supports. Certainly couldn't tell you what his platform was, what he said, what he hasn't. And yet, because of how tribal it was, and because of what the Chinese diaspora was doing in general, and because of the propaganda that was already on the table against Falun Gong from the CCP, I think Falun Gong got singled out a little bit more than everybody else and said, oh, let's put these guys in the Trump camp and attack them that way. And now once they're in that camp, any other time propaganda comes along, it's just going to have a lot more veracity.
Yeah, I mean, it really makes sense. Like if you're the Communist Party and you want Americans to turn on Falun Gong, call them racist Trump supporters.
Bingo.
I mean, I do think that it's also easier to, in a way, point at a group and demonize that group for liking Trump versus if you're like Chinese Americans like Trump, that makes them bad. That's a little dicey, right? Because then,
It's because it's like an ethnicity rather
rather than like, oh, an organization. And then you're like, well, this organization, what do we know about them? And then that CCP propaganda comes into play. But in some ways, you saw the same thing with Cuban Americans in Florida, where like there were a lot of articles written about like, why do Cuban Americans support Trump? And like,
the Latino white supremacists.
Yes, exactly.
And the black white supremacists.
Yeah.
It's a stupid time we're living in.
Well, I also think this is a clear example of how the CCP does play the long game when it comes to propaganda. Because if you look at all these things, they built on each other. 25 years ago, it was, they didn't get their act together for the first few months. When they first started their persecution, we're blocking traffic. That was the best they could come up with. And then after a few months,
they blocked traffic. Get them.
That is why they arrested Chen Guangchen, the blind Chinese lawyer, right? For blocking traffic.
Yeah.
And it's not even his fault.
That's why he got put in prison for blocking traffic.
Wow.
So that was the initial thing,
I didn't
right?
know that.
And then they put forward the cult thing, and they ride that out for a few years. Then Trump comes along. Now they're starting to sprinkle in racism. This is very clearly the long game to try and malign Falun Gong, and to some extent, it's having some traction.
Well, so what is the end game? Because I mean, it's not like Biden's going to start locking up Falun Gong.
I don't know if there is a rational end game when you've got your back against the wall. I mean, if you think about what the CCP has done to Falun Gong alone, let alone other groups, systematic organ harvesting for over a dozen years, right? The kind of torture, the kind of killing, I mean, there's just no backing down. The only thing you can do is stave off the inevitable, honestly. And I think
Some
that
kind
would
of global recognition.
some kind of global recognition. Now, perhaps they think, certainly they can't, Falun Gong's not going away. They know that. But perhaps they think there is an end game where if they can get enough of this propaganda to have enough traction and enough people to turn against Falun Gong, maybe they've got a way out. Maybe.
So, like, if the U.S. media is focusing on Falun Gong as a far-right racist cult, that's not a conversation about the Chinese Communist Party is harvesting the organs of Falun Gong.
Exactly.
Wow.
Well, so one of the problems that we're going to see is like if you look at Biden's China policy, like he's been, I think, not ideally like what I'd want to have him do on China, but I think he's been pretty good, right? Like he's pushed forward some of the sanctions. He's got the CHIPS Act. He said, he's called Xi Jinping a dictator twice. He said we're going to defend Taiwan, like all these things, right? And the CCP does not like this. But the problem is that Biden is really not Trump at all. And so they can go after Trump, but what if they also go after Biden, right? And then they've got a problem where now they've alienated all the Americans, right? And the more Biden does on China, especially if he does something specifically towards Falun Gong, which I don't know if he will, but then the Communist Party is in a real pickle, right? It would be worse if Biden was popular.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's the sort of going after the political figures, yeah. But also coming back to your question on the end game, I think the reverse of that is one thing that they see in Shen Yun. Like, this was interesting. Okay, so when people see the show, sometimes they come out and they give an interview and say, what did they just see? What was that? What was their experience? So I went through hundreds of these when I was doing this report. And sometimes, I came across a U.S. senator who's been very sort of clear on the CCP for years. And he's been working on this. He's not like ignorant of the issue. And he came out of the show, and one of the things he said is, that was the first time I could see clearly what a benign, friendly China would look like. And it was like for his mind, it was sort of, because the slogan is China before communism, but the implication is what China could be if communism goes away.
China after communism.
China after communism. And I think
time to change that slogan.
The U.S. senator saw that and said that was very, very clear. And that clarity, I think, is another thing that really, really scares the CCP.
The same way that Taiwan scares the CCP, right? That's a China without communism.
Yeah.
Well, so what does that mean? China before communism, China after communism. What is the China that's being portrayed in Shen Yun? Because I don't know if everyone has seen the show.
Well, I should qualify this with, when you talk to the folks at Shen Yun, clearly they did not make this show to be a political tool or even make a political statement. It's very clear that their mission is, okay, this was a beautiful, very profound culture that has universal value to everybody before the communists took over. Let's, first of all, save that from being destroyed. Let's figure out a way to share that with the world so that they can see how beautiful and just sort of how wonderful that culture is. And because they really believe that this has something that's very could be beneficial for the world. And you see that if you watch the interviews of people coming out of the show, people talk about hope and being inspired and like wanting to be a better person and all this kind of stuff. So, and I think the creators of Shen Yun, that was the goal, because they see that's what authentic China culture really does to somebody. It really uplifts them. So that's what they wanted to do. So that's sort of the impact. But again, I think that's also the thing that scares people, because they don't want, it scares the CCP because they don't want everybody coming to the conclusion that the senator came to, that, this is not only the real China, but it looks really good without the CCP.
Right. I mean, in fairness, though, like there are some, because I've seen Shen Yun and like maybe there's like 20 different like individual pieces, right? And like, a couple of them had like a political message, right? So it's not like completely out. It's not completely apolitical.
Well, I think from when I talk to the folks at Shen Yun, their perspective on it is, let's tell the China story. which is 5,000 years long and has all these dynasties, but a part of the China story, not just in the modern era, but in previous eras, is, what's happening to Falun Gong. So, and yeah, that's certainly the part of the performance that the CC probably likes the least.
Well, that's very interesting because one of Xi Jinping's propaganda pushes was to tell state media and all these entertainment apparatuses to tell the China story well.
So we should tell Xi about Shen Yun. They should put this on.
I bet he knows about it.
Yeah,
You think he does?
I think he does.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long and proud tradition of countries around the world having their like soft culture through
Soft power.
soft power, yeah, through dance. I mean, the U.S. has been doing this since probably the 50s, and China's certainly been doing it.
I mean, Russia used, or the USSR, the Soviet Union used ballet,
Right.
Yep.
which was somewhat undermined when people defected.
And they also got Zangief in Street Fighter, which was great, but only undermined by the fact that he was really the hardest character to play.
Okay. Sorry.
If you want to learn more about Street Fighter, I have a great episode on Gamers Unbeaten about Street Fighter and globalism. That's the best I can do with that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I was also thinking about like the CCP is probably kind of upset that Shen Yun is using Chinese culture this way because, like we talked about earlier, the CCP likes to use Chinese culture as a propaganda tool. And I was just thinking about this show that they have in Tibet about like this big song and dance thing that they show to all the tourists who are all Chinese tourists now because they don't let outsiders into Tibet. But it is essentially about this Tibetan princess who was married to a Chinese emperor. And the point of this whole production is to essentially solidify the CCP's claims over Tibet, right? Is to like put them in this historical context where you see like Tibet's been a part of China,
But there's a historical inaccuracy there, which is that happened during the Yuan dynasty, which was the Mongol dynasty when the Mongolians under Genghis Khan took over China. So that's basically promoting the China ruled by a foreign dynasty.
No. See, Matt, that's not how it goes because like once you take over China, you become Chinese and then,
Okay.
yeah.
So that's
So
fine.
if I took over China
Oh boy.
and triggered,
To your earlier point, Matt, I think there's
about Zangief in Street Fighter.
no, the one before that. I'm not qualified to address the Street Fighter. So there's the CCP's not happy about the cultural stuff. The CCP's not happy about the fact that they're, as part of the program of Shen Yun, you do see the persecution of what's happening in modern China. I think the other thing that they really don't like is, for 25 years, they've been trying to scare the Chinese people and actually everyone around the world that Falun Gong's this weird group. You got to stay away from them. They're this, they're that. And then you see the show, and pretty much everyone at Shen Yun is a Falun Gong practitioner. And these people are amazing in terms of the dances they can do and the stories they tell. And people come out of the theater going, wow, those people are amazing. Whoever put on that show. I mean, there have been people coming out of the show going, give the artistic director an Oscar for this. This is amazing. They don't want people doing anything that gives them the impression that Falun Gong people are amazing. And that's clearly on their agenda because that unravels 25 years of what is certainly a multi-billion-dollar smear campaign to convince people otherwise.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a factor.
yeah, they can dance if they want to.
In some ways, the CCP is like, the
They're no
town in
friend of mine.
I was going to say the town in Footloose who doesn't want, people to
That's right.
dance. Yeah. No, I hadn't thought about it that way.
truly evil.
Well, I hadn't thought about it that way in the sense that, how the CCP wants people to perceive individual, like, people who practice Falun Gong, right? Like that, again, it gets back to the whole, like, it's the propaganda or the pressure campaign, the transnational repression. They will go to, like, extreme lengths to change people's minds on such a, like, what to normal people would seem like, why does it matter if you like Falun Gong, or you like somebody who practices Falun Gong? Like, why is that a threat to the, second most powerful country in the world?
Yeah, why is it a threat that Falun Gong practitioners, they wave their arms around and stand still and sit still? Why was that public enemy number one for China?
Well, I mean, it started at that. I think now the big concern is, in addition to standing still, they're also talking now.
Yeah,
and
now.
they're saying about, what's happening in China, what the real nature of the CCP is. And I think that sort of again, they play the long game on the propaganda side, and they understand that if they can get people to think, oh, these people are weird, they won't listen to what these people are saying, and on and on. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think there's, what, in the beginning, probably Falun Gong was apolitical. That is not political, right? But it seems that at some point in the early 2000s, it started to like organize around criticizing the CCP, right? And that was a change. I mean, like in Falun Gong's defense, it was because they were being, killed for their organs and sent to labor camps by the CCP that they then spoke out and said, hey, this is bad. So that's 100% justifiable. But like what it means is that now you have all these people who are organized around this anti-CCP message, right? That was caused by the CCP doing it.
Tibetans and Uyghurs, like they have their own culture and identity outside of, the persecution that's happening against them. But now also part of their identity is trying to stand up and prevent that culture from being destroyed.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was actually two things. I mean, everything what you said, for sure.
Especially the Zangief part.
Everything you said in the last 30 seconds. For sure, the persecution is unleashed upon them. They're going to speak out about that, right? But there was something else before, while all that was happening, the Falun Gong community, certainly in China, was still not talking clearly and overtly about the CCP itself. It was just, hey, this is what's happening to us. It wasn't until, so there's this, starting in the early 2000s, there was this massive grassroots movement of Falun Gong practitioners, some supporters inside China, to kind of, because the state-run media was just sort of blasting all kinds of vilifying stuff, to actually go into the neighborhoods, door to door, telling people this is what's really happening to us. It wasn't until they started doing that and the response from their neighbors was, oh, well, I have to believe the CCP. The CCP says this about you, so therefore I believe it. And they sort of realized, we're not going to get through to these people until we tell them what the CCP really is. Then they'll listen to us about what's happening to us. It was really that really changed things, certainly inside China, and that sort of went around the world from there. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me now of we interviewed, was it Fang Zhen, the Taiwanese, not Taiwan, oh my gosh, the Tiananmen Square protester who...
Zhou Fengshuo?
No.
The one who lost his legs.
The one who lost his legs.
Okay.
And he talked about how essentially one of his big missions now is to tell young Chinese people the story of Tiananmen Square and the protests, because he said, essentially the CCP controls history and it controls people's minds by like keeping people in ignorance of what their true nature is. Like he was saying that, because his parents went through the cultural, or like went through like the persecutions during like the Cultural Revolution and earlier than that, but they didn't, under Mao, but they didn't talk about it because they tried to just like put it behind them, and you weren't like, everybody was scared to talk, right? And so he said his generation in the 80s like mistakenly believed that the CCP could reform. So that's what they were asking the CCP to do. They weren't asking the CCP to go away. They were just like, we want some economic reforms, we want some political reforms. And then the CCP crushed them. So then he was talking about how like if they had known really what the CCP had done to China earlier, maybe they wouldn't have had that like illusion about the CCP and what they would do.
I remember when we did that interview, also thinking about how, from what I've heard from Falun Gong practitioners we've interviewed, that they had that same mistake that he was talking about, that at the beginning they were like, oh, if we just explain what's going on, the party obviously will stop. And then the Uyghurs had that too. They're like, oh, this is just a misunderstanding. If we explain ourselves to the Communist Party officials, then it'll just
they'll understand.
Go away.
We just want to teach our language to our kids.
Yeah.
Like, what's harmful about that? Yeah, I do remember that.
And it's this consistent theme that when people don't understand the real nature of communism, and I am speaking about America now, people are susceptible to propaganda.
And just naivete. I mean, how many of the different illicit actions the CCP has done in America, whether it's the steal of IP or everything that they've done here, how much of that has been enabled by an ignorance of what the CCP is really about?
Yeah.
It's sort of communist government, but it's still a government, and still sort of in the back of the minds of most Americans, maybe some of the business folks, political folks, we're still it's not unreasonable to deal with them in this way, because they didn't really know what they're dealing with.
Yeah. Well, so since this was something you brought up earlier, that everyone is susceptible to propaganda, and
Well, except me
except for you
and Matt. Yeah.
Oh no, I'm very susceptible.
Well, and like it's the CCP is having a real impact on the U.S. with its propaganda. How do people watching? How do they learn to recognize this kind of propaganda? How can they not be? How can they be more like you and Matt?
Ooh. Well, that's a tough question. That's a tough question, and the reason that's a tough question is because it's kind of everywhere now. And part of the problem is not what you're reading, but what you're not reading. In terms of, you mentioned earlier that organ harvesting is going on for how many years? 15 years, 16 years. Which papers have completely ignored that issue all this time? And that's as much of a problem, perhaps, as some of the false stuff that you read. And that's really tough. I would say, I don't know how to answer that question. In terms of how to, the news you consume, how much of that is being shaped by the CCP, and how do you keep yourself clear of that? Boy, honestly, there's probably other communities that this is true of. Perhaps it's true of the Uyghurs and various outlets in Taiwan and Hong Kong. But from the one I know, I would say try and rely on Falun Gong related sources as much as possible, because whatever you may think of any other issues, one thing is for sure, it is not influenced by CCP manipulation. And you're going to get a source that's not going to be compromised in that way. Perhaps there's other sources in Taiwan and other places that you could look at as well.
So is there a particular website with perhaps Falun Dafa information, maybe a center of that Falun Dafa information that people could go to?
I've heard of one called the Falun Dafa Information Center.
Oh.
Yeah. And that's probably a pretty good source. And not only for articles talking about stuff topics we're covering today, but there's also a whole video section and a library section, covers reports, documentaries. Pretty good place.
Yeah, what's that website?
FalunInfo.net, which is FALUNINFO.net.
Shelley's just laughing because it's .net.
It was created a long time ago.
It's like, do you have a Hotmail account, Levi?
I think it was created with a dial-up. Yeah.
Wow.
Those were the days.
Well, yes.
Wow.
Get off the computer. I need to use the phone.
I think we had an AOL account at that point. Yeah.
Wow. Well, yes, thank you very much for joining us. We'll put a link to that below. If you'd like, you can take this. It's just a little wet.
That's gross, Chris.
Pleasure to have you on. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
We'll talk to you next time.